On December 12, 2000, in the executive offices of General Motors in Detroit, the leadership of the largest car maker on earth announced that it would put one of its own divisions to death. The division was Oldsmobile. That morning it was 103 years old, the oldest surviving automobile brand in America, older than General Motors itself, older than the Ford Motor Company. The stated reason was profitability. To retire the name, General Motors would take a one-time charge against its earnings of somewhere between $1.5 and $2.5 billion. It was paying a fortune, in plain terms, simply to make a 103-year-old name disappear. There was an irony in that decision the announcement did not dwell on. The brand General Motors had just condemned was the brand that had taught the industry how to build a car in the first place. Before Henry Ford built a single Model T, a small runabout out of Lansing, Michigan, had already become the first mass-produced, low-priced automobile in America, built on the first automobile assembly line the country had ever seen. Oldsmobile did not follow the American car business. It started it. The received story of how the brand ended is a simple one, and it is wrong. In that telling, Oldsmobile grew old and tired, its cars dull and its buyers graying, until the market quietly walked away. But the market did not kill Oldsmobile. Its own parent did. Across the last 25 years of the brand's life, General Motors took it apart from the inside, one decision at a time. It charged Oldsmobile prices for another division's engines. It broke a generation's trust with a diesel that failed in driveways across the country, and it insulted the loyal customers it had left in the very campaign meant to win it new ones. That campaign was built around a single line. General Motors told the country again and again that this was not your father's Oldsmobile. It was a strange thing for a company to say about its own product, and stranger still once the same company decided the brand would be nobody's Oldsmobile at all. The story of how Oldsmobile was hollowed out from within and then buried by the corporation that owned it does not begin in a Detroit boardroom in the winter of 2000. It begins in Lansing, Michigan in 1897 with the man whose name was on the door. Chapter 1. The car that put America on wheels. The man whose name was on the door was Ransom E. Olds. On August 21, 1897, in Lansing, Michigan, he incorporated the Olds Motor Vehicle Company, a small works of brick and timber turning out horseless carriages one at a time for a country that still moved mostly by horse. There was nothing inevitable about it. Lansing was a mill town, not an industrial capital, and the men who built the first Oldsmobiles built them the way every early car maker did, slowly, by hand, each machine a little different from the last. For 4 years, the company was one more hopeful shop in a field crowded with hopeful shops, and its founder was casting about for the design that would separate his cars from the rest. The design found him by accident, and it found him through fire. On March 9, 1901, the Olds Motor Works factory in Detroit burned to the ground. The building went, the tooling went, the drawings and the work in progress went, and out of the flames a single machine was carried to safety. It was a little runabout with a curved wooden dash at the front, light, simple, and cheap to build, assembled largely from parts bought in from outside suppliers rather than machined in the plant. When the smoke cleared, it was nearly all that survived. The company had lost almost everything except the one car it could actually afford to make in quantity. That accident set the course of the American automobile. With his factory gone and only the little curved dash left to build, Ransom Olds committed the company to the one thing the surviving design made possible, which was volume. Because the runabout was assembled from outsourced, standardized components, it could be put together in stages, each worker adding his piece as the chassis moved down the line. Olds built the first automobile assembly line in the country to do it, a technique he pioneered and patented in the earliest years of the century. The idea that would later make Henry Ford the most famous industrialist on earth was running in Lansing first. Before there was a Model T, before there was a River Rouge, the moving assembly line was already carrying Oldsmobiles toward the loading dock. The result was a car ordinary people could buy. The curved dash Oldsmobile sold for about $650 at a time when most automobiles were priced for the wealthy, and America answered. It became the best-selling car in the United States in 1903 and again in 1904, the first machine to prove that the automobile was not a rich man's novelty, but a mass-market good. It became, as well, the first automobile the country sang about. In 1905, a Tin Pan Alley tune called In My Merry Oldsmobile grew into one of the hit songs of the year, its chorus carrying the marque into parlors that had never seen a motor car, and the company seized on the free advertising at once. Production climbed with the fame, from 2,500 runabouts in 1902 to more than 5,500 in 1904, the first quantity production the American automobile had ever known. By the time production ended in late 1906, roughly 19,000 of the little runabouts had been built, an enormous enormous number for the era, and the pattern of the entire industry to come had been set in a single Lansing works. Standardize the parts, move the chassis, sell it cheap, and sell it to everyone. The company that had done this should have belonged, in every sense that mattered, to the man whose name it carried. It did not. Even as the curved dash was putting the nation on wheels, Ransom Olds and the investors who controlled the Olds Motor Works were at odds over the future of the product, and the founder lost. He was pushed aside by his own ownership and walked out of the company that bore his name. He was not finished with automobiles. He started again from nothing, founding a new car company under his own initials, and when the Olds Motor Works threatened to sue him for using the family name a second time, he was forced to shorten it to the letters alone. The cars he built for the rest of his career carried the name REO, 3 initials that were all the courts would leave him of the name still lettered across the factory he had lost. What he left behind did not stay independent for long. In 1908, William Durant, the promoter who was in those years assembling a collection of car makers into a single corporation, bought the Oldsmobile company and folded it into his new combine. The name of that combine was General Motors. From that year forward, Oldsmobile was no longer a company with a founder and a conscience of its own. It was a division, one brand among several, its fate decided in a corporate headquarters by men who had not built it and did not carry its name. The firm that had invented the American way of making cars would spend the next 96 years as the property of a parent that would one day decide it was worth more dead than alive. None of that was visible in 1908. The curved dash had made Oldsmobile a household word, the assembly line had made it a pioneer, and the young division carried into General Motors a reputation as the place where the American car had first been built for everyone. That reputation was an asset, and General Motors would spend the good decades ahead putting it to work, turning Oldsmobile into its proving ground for engineering and its ladder into the middle-class driveway. The founder was gone, and the parent was installed. The building of the empire could begin. Chapter 2. The Rocket and the Crown. For the better part of half a century, the reputation William Durant had bought paid steady dividends. Inside General Motors, Oldsmobile was neither the cheapest brand nor the grandest, but it held a place the others did not. It was the division where the corporation did its engineering out loud, the proving ground where a new idea was tried on the public before the rest of the range was trusted with it. Chevrolet sold in volume and Cadillac sold in luxury, and Oldsmobile was where General Motors demonstrated that it could still build something first. The founder's old instinct to do the new thing before anyone else did it had outlived the founder by decades. The clearest proof arrived in 1949. That year, the engineers in Lansing finished a compact, high-compression overhead valve V8 of 303 cubic inches and set it into one of the division's lighter bodies. They called the engine the Rocket, and the automobile that carried it the Rocket 88. On paper, it produced 135 horsepower, a modest figure by the standards of a later age, but in a car that weighed comparatively little, it was a revelation. The overhead valve design could breathe and rev in ways the old flathead engines could not, and it could be made to yield more and more power as the years went on. The post-war American road had been waiting for exactly this, and the Rocket 88 announced itself the moment it reached the showroom floor. What followed was the horsepower race, and Oldsmobile started it. The Rocket engine did not stay on the boulevard, on the dirt ovals and beach courses of the new stock car circuits. The Rocket 88 won and kept winning, dominating the earliest seasons of American stock car racing when the sport was still rough, southern, and half outlaw. It went farther south still. In the Carrera Panamericana, the brutal road race run the length of Mexico over open highway, the Oldsmobile with the Rocket engine came home a winner, beating heavier and more expensive machines across thousands of miles of mountain and desert. The advertising promised the ordinary buyer a share of it. Make a date with a Rocket 8, the campaign said, and a generation of American drivers did exactly that. For a moment, an Oldsmobile was the fastest ordinary thing in the country, and the Rocket badge on the fender meant that the engineering underneath it was real. The engineering did not end with the engine. In 1966, the division delivered the Toronado, the first front-wheel drive car General Motors had ever built, and the first mass-produced American automobile to drive its front wheels since the Cord had died out in 1937, nearly 3 decades before. It arrived without a rival in its own country and carried off Motor Trend's Car of the Year, and it confirmed what the Rocket had first suggested, that when General Motors wanted to prove it could still build something the others could not, it handed the assignment to Oldsmobile. The founder's old instinct to do the new thing first was still paying out half a century after he had walked out the door. The speed built a reputation, and the reputation built a fortune. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Oldsmobile turned its engineering name into steady, enormous sales, climbing out of the specialist corner and into the center of the American market. The instrument of that conquest was a mid-size car called the Cutlass. Introduced modestly and grown over the years into the heart of the middle-class driveway, the Cutlass became, for the 1976 model year, the best-selling car in the entire United States. It was not a machine for enthusiasts or for the wealthy. It was the car a school teacher bought, and a foreman and a family with one income and 3 children, the automobile that sat in 10,000 suburban driveways because it was handsome enough to be proud of and sound enough to be trusted. By the middle of the 1980s, that trust had compounded into a scale almost no American brand had ever reached. Oldsmobile was selling more than 1 million cars a year, one of only a handful of nameplates in the entire history of the American automobile ever to cross that line. A division that had begun with a single runabout carried out of a fire was now, 3/4 of a century later, moving more than 1 million machines in a single year, its rocket name on the engines and its badge on the country's best-selling car. The crown William Durant had reached for in 1908 sat, at last, squarely on the brand's head. And there was the danger, though no one in Lansing was looking at it that way. Everything that made the mid-1980s peak so complete, the million cars, the loyal middle-class buyer, the reputation for engineering that reached back to the rocket and beyond it to the curved dash, was an asset built entirely out of trust. And trust was the one thing on the balance sheet that could not be manufactured a second time once it was spent. For 80 years, Oldsmobile had taught Americans that its badge meant the machine was real and the promise was good. That inheritance was worth more than any single model in the catalog, and precisely because it had taken generations to build, it was the thing a parent corporation in a hurry could destroy far faster than it could ever be rebuilt. The instrument of the peak had been an engine. The instrument of the fall would be an engine too. The first blow did not come from a rival or from a recession, and it did not come from outside the corporation at all. It came from inside General Motors, from a quiet decision to put the wrong engine under the Oldsmobile hood and to tell the buyer nothing. Chapter 3. The engine that wasn't there. The decision was made for the most ordinary reason a corporation ever has. By 1977, the Oldsmobile division had become a victim of its own success. The full-size Delta 88 was selling faster than Lansing could build the engines to fill it, and the Rocket 5.8 plants, the very works whose name carried everything the brand had spent 80 years earning, could not keep pace with the orders. Inside General Motors, a calculation followed that a corporation which owned every division could solve an Oldsmobile shortage with a Chevrolet surplus. The Chevrolet 350 was in ample supply. It would bolt into the same engine bay, and the buyer, it was assumed, would never think to look. So the substitution was made quietly and at scale. More than half of that year's Delta 88s, over 75,000 cars, went down the line with the Chevrolet 350 under the hood in place of the Oldsmobile rocket engine the advertising had promised and the customer had paid a premium to receive. Nothing on the car announced the change. The fender still wore the word rocket, the single syllable the division had spent a generation teaching Americans to trust, and beneath it sat an engine built in another division for cheaper cars. The premium was collected in full. The product behind the premium had been swapped for the corporation's own convenience, and the men who authorized the swap evidently believed that an engine was an engine and a customer was a marque. For a time, the assumption held. The cars ran, the orders shipped, and the shortage eased. What the calculation had not accounted for was a single buyer stubborn enough to open the hood and knowledgeable enough to understand what he was seeing. In Chicago, a man named Joseph Seawick brought his new Oldsmobile in for routine service and found a Chevrolet block sitting where a rocket was supposed to be. He had bought an Oldsmobile, he had been handed something else, and charged the Oldsmobile price for it. And unlike the tens of thousands of owners who never lifted the hood, Seawick refused to let the discovery go. Motor Eulogies investigates the American car empires that were buried by the corporations that built them. If these accounts are worth the time, subscribing keeps the investigation going. And this one was only beginning to open. What started as one man's complaint became a reckoning the corporation could not quietly settle. 40 separate fraud suits followed, 14 of them brought by states, acting not for a single deceived owner, but on behalf of every General Motors buyer who might have been handed the same substitution without knowing it, and 26 more pressed by individuals who had bought an Oldsmobile and found a Chevrolet. The evidence was not in dispute because the engines were exactly what the plaintiffs said they were. General Motors, the largest industrial corporation on earth, was forced to offer to buy the cars back, crediting each owner the full purchase price of the automobile automobile and deducting only 8 cents for every mile already driven. It was, in the plainest terms the law allowed, a public admission that the company had sold one thing under the name of another and been caught doing it. Money settled the suits. It could not settle what the suits had revealed. A corporation that would fit a rival division's engine under an Oldsmobile hood, collect the Oldsmobile premium, and say nothing had disclosed something about how it now regarded the names in its own catalog. For decades, the divisions had meant different things, and the difference was the entire reason a buyer chose one badge over another. The engine swap of 1977 was the first public evidence that somewhere inside the corporation, the differences had stopped mattering, that Oldsmobile and Chevrolet and the rest had begun to look from the executive floor like interchangeable labels on a common machine. The question worth leaving in the comments is whether a company willing to do this in 1977 had already decided, a full quarter century before the funeral, that its oldest division was a nameplate and nothing more. Whatever the boardroom believed, the buyers drew their own conclusion, and it was the more expensive one. The scandal cost General Motors the buyback money and the legal fees, but the larger loss appeared on no settlement sheet. 80 years of trust, the one asset the corporation could not manufacture a second time, had been spent to cover a production shortfall. The badge that had meant the machine was real now carried a public record of the corporation lying about exactly that. And a customer who has learned that the name on the fender cannot be believed does not unlearn it when the next model arrives. The next model was already coming. Even as the engine suits ground through the courts, Oldsmobile was preparing to sell the American public a different engine entirely, one the division promised would answer the fuel crisis and carry the brand into the coming age of the economical car. The Rocket had built the name, and a borrowed Chevrolet block had cracked it. The engine that came next would do far worse than disappoint. It would strand its owners at the roadside by the thousands and take the last of the brand's good word down with it. Chapter 4. The Diesel That Broke Its Word. The next engine arrived dressed as a rescue. By 1978, the second oil shock had taught American drivers to watch the fuel gauge with something close to fear, and General Motors put Oldsmobile forward as the division that would carry the country into the age of the economical car. The answer it proposed was a diesel, a 5.7-liter V8, that promised the frugality of a truck engine in a family sedan, and the pitch turned on a single virtue: economy, the sensible choice for a suspicious decade. The brand that had lit the post-war horsepower race now presented itself as the voice of restraint. For a moment, the reversal worked. Buyers who had trusted the name through the Rocket years trusted it again and signed for the diesel on the strength of a badge that had not yet failed them twice. What the buyer could not see was how the engine had been made. The 5.7-liter diesel was not designed as a diesel. It was the gasoline 350 pressed into far harder duty, converted rather than engineered to spare the corporation the cost of building a true diesel from the ground up. The men who adapted it kept the gasoline engine's head bolt pattern and much of its existing tooling and fitted the enormous compression of diesel combustion into a block and a bolt layout that had been drawn for a milder engine burning a gentler fuel. It was thrift applied to the wrong ledger, a saving taken on the assembly floor and charged against everything that happened to the car after it left it. The bill came due at the roadside. Head gaskets blew, injection pumps failed, cranks broke, the head bolts that had been asked to restrain a diesel with a gasoline engine's hardware let go. Coolant reached the cylinders, and the owners who had bought frugality found themselves stranded on shoulders and marooned in service bays across the country, waiting on repairs while the warranty argued the terms. Bad word travels faster than any advertisement, and within a few model years, the reputation the diesel had borrowed from the Rocket was gone. Reliability had been the whole meaning of the Oldsmobile name. It was now the one thing the name could no longer promise. The failure had been foreseen, and the record shows it was foreseen inside the company before the first car was sold. In 1977 and 1978, as the design was readied for production, a GM engineer tested it and read the results without flinching. In test after test, the engine came apart at the crank and the block, the very failures that would later strand paying customers in their own driveways, and he warned against building it. The warning did not move the schedule. The car went forward on the calendar the corporation had already set, and in 1980, as the diesels failed in the field precisely as they had failed on the bench, the engineer who had objected was forced into retirement. The man who had been right was removed. The engine he had condemned stayed in the catalog 5 more years, sold through 1985 to buyers who were never told the argument had been had and lost before they walked into the showroom. Nothing on the car carried that history. The deck lid wore the word diesel the way in earlier decades fenders had worn rocket, a single word offered as a promise, and beneath it sat an engine its own maker's engineer had asked the company not to build. The optimism ran ahead of the evidence for as long as the advertising could keep pace, and then the failures caught it and passed it. The damage did not stop at Oldsmobile. The 5.7-liter diesel soured American drivers on the diesel passenger car so completely that the technology all but disappeared from the domestic market for a generation. A single bad engine closing a door on an entire class of automobile. Its wreckage even helped write the law. The stranded owners and their contested repairs became part of the pressure behind the spread of state lemon laws, statutes drafted in part to shield buyers from exactly the experience an Oldsmobile diesel had handed them. A brand that had once put the country on wheels had now helped put on the books the rules that policed car makers who broke their word. That was the deeper cost, and it appeared on no warranty claim. For 80 years, the Oldsmobile name had been an instruction to trust the machine under the hood. The diesel turned the instruction inside out. A maker that had taught America to believe in the engine under the hood had begun teaching a generation of its own buyers to believe nothing it printed, and a lesson learned at the roadside is not unlearned in the showroom. The good word was spent. What remained was a division that had lost its engine's reputation, its founder's name, and now the faith of the people who had gone on buying anyway. When the corporation next moved to save the brand, it would reach not for a better car, but for an advertisement. And the advertisement it chose would insult the very buyers it still had left. Chapter 5, Not Your Father's Funeral. The advertisement arrived in 1988, and it opened by apologizing for the car. The campaign was built around a single line, "This is not your father's Oldsmobile," offered as a promise of reinvention, and it became instead one of the most quoted acts of self-harm in the history of American marketing. The commercials paired fading celebrities with their grown children. William Shatner appeared beside his daughter Melanie. Ringo Starr and others of that same vintage were enlisted to the same purpose. Each aging star conscripted to testify that the marque they stood for was no longer the marque their generation remembered. The meaning under the slogan was plain to anyone who had spent a working life buying the brand. The Oldsmobile you trusted is the one we are now asking you to be embarrassed by. The pitch was aimed at a customer Oldsmobile did not have and delivered to the customer it could not afford to lose. General Motors wanted the young buyer, the one shopping the Japanese imports, and it spent a campaign chasing him. The young buyer did not come. The older buyer did. The loyal owner who had forgiven the Chevrolet engine and outlasted the diesel now heard his own choice described in prime time as his father's mistake. A brand cannot recruit a new generation by shaming the one still signing the checks, and Oldsmobile had few checks left to lose. Production had already fallen by more than a third before the first commercial aired. The advertisement meant to reverse the decline, instead handed it a catchphrase, and the catchphrase outlived the cars. What came after was not a collapse but an erosion, slow enough that no single year could be blamed for it. Through the 1990s, the Oldsmobile grew harder to distinguish from the divisions beside it, its models drawn from the same corporate parts bins, its badge affixed to cars a Buick or a Pontiac shopper might just as easily have bought, and increasingly did. The rocket engineering was a memory. The founder's name had become a museum placard. The reputation for reliability had been spent at the roadside a decade before. Everything that had once made the name mean a particular thing had been disassembled piece by piece by the corporation that owned it until the name meant only itself, and then not even that. On December 12, 2000, the corporation stopped pretending the patient might recover. Rick Wagner, then the president of General Motors, announced that the company would phase out Oldsmobile, and the reason he gave was profitability. It was an accountant's word for a wound the accountant's own firm had inflicted. To retire the name, GM booked a one-time pre-tax charge of between $1.5 billion and $2.5 billion against its fourth quarter earnings, part of a wider restructuring that cut roughly 16,000 jobs across the United States and Europe. The oldest surviving American automobile brand was not mourned into the ground. It was closed the way a plant is idled, as a line on a ledger, by executives who had decided that a 103-year-old name was worth less than the cost of keeping it. The killing carried a second price the announcement did not linger on. Oldsmobile did not belong to General Motors alone. It belonged, under state franchise law, to roughly 2,800 dealers who held protected rights to sell it, and those rights could not be canceled by memo. GM had to purchase them back. The dealer wind-down ran past $1 billion on its own, with individual dealers paid as much as about $4 million to surrender their stores, and even those sums did not settle the matter because dealers who judged the terms too low took the corporation to court. Ending the brand cost a fortune in charges. It cost a second fortune to unwind the very network that had once sold the country its cars. The end itself was quiet, and it came to the place where it had begun. On April 29, 2004, the last Oldsmobile rolled off the line in Lansing, Michigan, the city where Ransom Olds had founded the company 107 years before. It was an Alero, a mid-sized sedan, barely distinguishable from a dozen others on the same lots, and the workers who assembled it signed their names to its body as it passed, the way a family signs a cast or a coffin. More than 35 million Oldsmobiles had been built across those 107 years, from the curved dash runabout that started it all to the anonymous sedan that closed the account. The oldest American marque that had ever existed had become the oldest American marquee ever shut down. There was a symmetry in it the corporation would never have chosen. Oldsmobile had invented the thing General Motors was built to do. It had drawn the first automobile assembly line, sold the first mass-produced American car, and put the country on wheels before Henry Ford turned a bolt, handing the industry the method that made every fortune that followed, including the fortune that finally judged the name not worth keeping. The child had taught the parent to build. The parent outlived the child.